Hello everyone and welcome to this video tutorial on how to apply the law on misrepresentation to a contract law scenario. In this tutorial we're going to be looking at the Liam and the cake shop mini scenario. We're going to recap the law on misrepresentation so we can pull out the issues in this scenario, and then we're going to look at how we would use the idea structure to get a really nice answer to this question. Let's start by taking a look at the scenario we've been given then. So the situation is that Liam buys a cake shop after being told by the previous owner, Mandy, that, quote, it was a little gold mine, and that, quote, in the previous year, the shop turned over £100,000. He trusted her and therefore turned down her offer to review the accounts. After buying the shop, he discovers that the shop had only turned over £78,000. And you're being asked to advise Liam on what he can do about what has turned out to be these false statements. We're looking at misrepresentation here because if you recall, misrepresentation is a false statement of fact or law which induces the representee to enter a contract. And when you look at this situation, we've got statements here, it's a little gold mine, and in the previous year it turned over 100,000 when it's actually turned over 78,000. Clearly, we've got false statements being made, which seem to have induced Liam into buying the shop. So it'd be useful at this point, I think, just to quickly recap what the law on misrepresentation is. So here's our little summary slide. Remember that I have made a separate video tutorial on misrepresentation in which I go through all of the rules, all of the cases, all of the definitions in detail. So it might be a good idea to watch that video again before you come to this one and try to apply the law so that it's all fresh in your mind. As a recap then, misrepresentation is where a false statement has been made in the run-up to negotiations, but that false statement is not a term of the contract. And so rather than it being a term and you've got a course of action in breach of contract, we can sue in misrepresentation. And the effect of a finding of misrepresentation is that the contract is voidable, i.e. the contract exists but can be set aside by the representee, and we call that rescission. And the remedy available depends on the type of misrepresentation, but usually we get rescission and or damages. So in order to succeed in a claim for misrepresentation, this is what Liam wants to do because presumably he wants to have his contract set aside. He doesn't want this cake shop anymore. He would have to prove, firstly, that Mandy had made a false statement of fact, and secondly, that it had induced him to enter into the contract. And once he'd done that, we'd have to work out which type of misrepresentation it is, fraudulent, negligent, or innocent, because the finding of what type of misrepresentation determines whether he can get rescission and or damages. So for our false statement of fact, it has to be a statement of fact, not a future intention. That comes from Edgington and Fitzmaurice. And importantly, it shouldn't be of opinion. Okay, it's got to be a false statement of fact. So if someone gives their opinion on something, then that's not actionable. So always look out for that in scenarios, and we'll look at that closely when we look at what Mandy said. It has to be said by one party to the other party, logically before or at the time of contracting, because if it wasn't before or at the time that the contract was entered into, clearly it didn't induce the other party into the contract. And that comes from Rescorla and Thomas, and silence is not enough. So they have to have actually made a statement, not kept quiet, knowing that the other person was making an error. So once it's been established that a false statement has been made, it's then necessary for the representee to demonstrate that the false statement induced them to enter the contract. And there can be no inducement or reliance if the representee was unaware of the false statement, or if the representee or their agent checks out the validity of the statement, then clearly they've not relied on it. And you can look at the cases of Atwood and Small and Jebb Fasteners on that. So if we think we've got a false statement which has induced the contract, we then have to determine what type of misrepresentation it might be. And the worst type is fraudulent misrepresentation. And Lord Herschel defined a fraudulent misrepresentation, in the case of Derry and Peake. And that's a statement which is made either knowing it to be false without belief in its truth, or recklessly careless as to whether it be true or false. We've then got negligent misrepresentation, and negligent misrepresentation can come under Hedley, Byrne and Heller, and it can also come under the Misrepresentation Act. And I'm just going to add that in there. It should have been on that slide. Originally, negligent misrepresentation came from common law, from the case of Hedley, Byrne and Heller. But it has since been included in Section 2.1 of the Misrepresentation Act 1967. So you can use either common law or the Act. It's preferable now to use the Act. Under Section 2.1 of the Misrep Act, a negligent misrepresentation is a statement made without reasonable grounds for belief in its truth. So that might be where someone could have quite easily found out the truth of the statement. The burden of proof is on the representor to demonstrate that they had reasonable grounds for believing the statement to be true. The final type of misrepresentation is an innocent misrepresentation, and this exists where the representor can demonstrate reasonable grounds for belief in the truth of the statement. And the remedies available for misrepresentation are dependent on the type of misrep. For all types, the remedy of rescission is available, and this puts the parties back in their pre-contractual position, which is, of course, what Liam's going to want because he doesn't want this cake shop anymore. And each party gives back the benefit which they've received under the contract. Where there's been a fraudulent misrep, the innocent party is entitled to rescind the contract and claim damages, and the damages that are awarded are not based on contractual principles but damages available in the tort of deceit. For negligent misrepresentation, the Misrep Act states that the same remedies are available where the statement was made negligently as if it were made fraudulently, meaning damages and rescission, whereas for innocent misrepresentation, you can only claim for rescission or damages instead of rescission. They can't claim both. Okay, so damages and rescission for both fraudulent and negligent, just damages or rescission for an innocent misrepresentation. Okay, so now that we've got the law recapped and a bit fresher in our minds, let's go back to the Liam and Mandy situation and see what we've got here. So in the exam, useful to highlight the statements that you've got. So we've actually got two here from Mandy. Firstly, she says that the cake shop was, quote, a little gold mine. And secondly, that, quote, in the previous year, the shop turned over £100,000. He's turned down her offer to review the accounts. So we're being told that because he's relying on it, isn't he? He's believing what she's saying is true. He's basically saying, no, I don't need to check. It turned over 100,000. If you said it did, it did. But the truth of the matter is it only actually turned over 78,000. So we need to show that there was a false statement of fact which induced the contract. We seem to have inducement here because he trusted her. So key phrase there, he trusted her, he took her on her word. Now, have we got false statements of fact? Now, it was a little gold mine is a bit problematic because that could potentially just be a statement of opinion like Bissett and Wilkinson. However, when she actually gives a figure, it turns over £100,000, that's clearly not opinion, that's a false statement of fact. And we know it's false because we know what it actually turns over. So even if we have a problem with the little gold mine comment, we can certainly take action on this one because it's a false statement of fact which induced the contract. So now we know what the issues are here. How do we write that up nicely to get full AO1 and AO2 marks? Let's have a look at how we use IDEA specifically on misrepresentation. As always, we're going to IDEA, identify, define, explain, and apply. So we would identify that the claimant, in this case Liam, might be able to have their contract rescinded and or claim damages if the statement is a misrepresentation. We then define misrepresentation. So it's a false statement of fact or law which induces the representee to enter a contract, and it makes the contract voidable, meaning that the contract still stands until challenged, until rescinded. So if Liam wanted to keep the cake shop anyway, even though he's discovered she's lied about how much it turns over, he can do, but it is voidable. We then explain all of the rules on misrepresentation using cases. So you're going to explain false statement of fact, inducement, and then the 3 different types. And make sure you explain the different types really clearly. Give a definition of each. You need to explain the rules in Headley, Byrne and Heller. I should also add in there section 2.1, the Misrepresentation Act. Whoops. There we go. Okay, so make sure you explain all of that fully. And then we're just going to use that almost as a checklist for our application. So we look, has there been a false statement of fact? So you have to look at the quote, the statement that's been given, and check that it is a false statement of fact, not opinion, not a statement of future intention. You then need to look at whether it induced the contract. So did your claimant definitely rely on it, or did they check for themselves so that they didn't rely on what had been said? You then need to work out what type of misrep it is. Do you think it's fraudulent, negligent, or innocent? And once you've decided which it is, you can conclude on the remedy. So if it was fraudulent or negligent, remember, they get rescission and damages. If it was innocent, they can have rescission or damages. They can't have both. So on my next slide, I've done a bullet point mark scheme for this Liam and the cupcake scenario. It is a bit small, so you might want to pause the video here so that you can have a good read of it. As always, it's quite listy, just to show you the content that should be in there. You are going to write in full sentences, explaining all your cases, all your rules, giving you definitions fully. So we've already talked about the I, D and the E. Okay, so I've identified Liam might be able to claim in misrep. I've defined misrep. I've explained misrep with all of my cases, but let's focus here on my application. So in my application, I firstly pointed out the 2 statements that might be a problem. So I've said Mandy makes 2 statements about the shop. Firstly, it was a little gold mine, and secondly, that it turned over £100,000. I've started with her first statement, it was a little gold mine. And what I've said about that is that might not be actionable because it seems to be an opinion, Bissett and Wilkinson. Although if you're telling someone something's a gold mine, it's a bit of a tricky one because you are saying it turns over a lot of money. So it's a bit unclear whether that's fact or opinion, but it doesn't matter too much because she then goes on to say, it turns over £100,000, and we know that's false later on. So even if that one's a problem, might be an opinion, the statement about turnover is definitely one of fact, not opinion. It was made before or at the time of the contracting, so that first requirement for misrep is met. And it seems to have induced Liam because he relied on it. I've dropped in Atwood there. And he didn't get anyone to check the accounts because he trusted Mandy. And I've put that in inverted commas because that's the word from the scenario. And we can use Jeb there. So that second element is met. Now, what type of misrep is it? Well, it seems that Mandy may have made the statement knowing that it's false, Derry and Peak. So if I was in the exam writing fully, I'd say maybe she's lying about the turnover because she wants to sell the shop. But she is at least negligent for not checking. So even if we can't prove fraud here, we can say, well, it's her shop. She should have looked at the accounts before she made a statement about turnover. So she's negligent. It's definitely not innocent. So Liam can ask for rescission and damages under misrepresentation. I'm going to take that or out, sorry about that. So Liam can ask for rescission and damages under the Misrepresentation Act. He could also use the common law, Hedley, Byrne, and Heller, but it's preferable, it's easier to use the misrepresentation.